Hi there and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now today we actually get back to the Station Road layout. So of course the last couple of episodes have been focused on some layout planning for Paul's layout at Sandling Junction. So today we'll return to the Goodsyard and continue on with some modelling progress that I've been making in this area. So where I last left off, I was of course looking at the retaining wall between the Goodsyard and the station area. So some further progress has been made with this retaining wall and also a little bit of fencing that goes at the end of the yard. So the first part of this video will be just going over where we're up to with the completed retaining wall and this little bit of fencing, and of course this is all in preparation for treating the groundwork around the Goodsyard area, so the goods sidings, and also of course within the goods shed itself. And of course they were some of the questions I asked in some of the previous videos, which was what happens inside that goods shed. Is it a hard standing or is it generally compacted ground similar to what of course is in the goods sidings? So I think without further ado, let's just jump into what I got up to. So as you can see, we now have the retaining wall complete, and this is now being actually anchored into place onto this lift out section. So this is just glued with PVA glue and temporarily pinned in place while it dried. I've now of course added capping stones, which of course have had super glue drizzled over them. That adds to their durability. And of course I completed the other side of the retaining wall as well, and then the whole thing was just given a nice coat of matte spray varnish to seal everything into place. So you'll now notice I've added some angled buttresses along here, and it was the intention to add something here just to give it that additional strength. Now it was commented on by someone in the previous video that it seemed odd that these upper buttresses floated, but interestingly the Metcalf kits often they did actually float. So whether that's based on any prototypical architectural element or not is, I'm not too sure, but the intention here really is this retaining wall is actually holding back quite a lot of earth and also of course train movements up above. So it kind of made sense the wall had these additional buttresses for that strength required to hold all of this back. So the buttresses were just made using some balsa wood, which I cut to a specific angle, and then of course wrapped brickwork around it, and then of course they were also weathered. So one of the other things you'll notice, I've now added in a bit of this chain link fence around here, which of course is similar to over in the other area there. I sort of thought of continuing that chain link fence on. It sort of pairs up with the fence over in the goods depot area. So it's interesting, there was another comment, and this is from Tim, and Tim actually offers up a lot of great suggestions and ideas, and he suggested a dilapidated wooden fence in this area, and I did actually consider that as well initially, but this whole area is a lift out section, and my concern really was this being right close to the edge of this lift out section, that I needed something that is really durable and solid, whereas a wooden fence, I kind of feel like each time I lift it out I've got to be really careful not to break the wooden fence. So when it came to installing this chain link fence, you may recall from a previous video, when I installed the chain link fence over there, I ran into issues getting the holes in the correct locations. So my thoughts were, how can I position this fence and get the holes accurately placed? And I thought a nice simple idea would be to place a piece of A4 paper on some of that high density foam and poke the fence posts into that, therefore creating the holes exactly where they need to go, then placing this paper template onto this area and then marking out the holes and drilling them. Now, one would assume that that would actually work quite well, but once again, the holes still didn't end up in the correct places, and there was a lot of fiddling around and drilling new holes and so forth to get this fence into place. But in the end, I got it in, and this fence is really solid. It's not going to move anywhere. So one of the other components I've added is just some base scatter into this landform around the end here. I've held off applying any further foliage details until I've actually got the yard groundwork into place, and then I can actually start to build up the overgrowth and so forth once that's complete. So in terms of the preparation now for the ground cover, the retaining wall in place, the wire chain link fence into place, and we can begin looking at the ground material around these tracks. Now this brings us to the question I had in the last video, which was what happens inside the goods shed in terms of the base or the ground area around the tracks. Now there was some debate about whether maybe I do it with cobblestone area, and in some cases it would seem it's just purely a compacted gravel ground material. So once again, thank you for all the comments in the previous video regarding the decision for this material inside the goods shed area. And in general, really, it seems possibly that it is a compacted sort of earth gravel type material, as opposed to a hard standing of some sort, whether it be cobblestones or concrete. Now, some interesting comments that came up were that whatever was used inside the goods shed was purely based on the budget that was available to build the goods shed in the first place, or whether it was a country goods shed or whether it was an urban goods shed. So based on that, the goods shed I have is sort of based on a lighter workload type shed. It's not a high traffic goods depot area. So I'm going to use the compacted ground type material as opposed to cobblestones. So I did have a wee hunt around on the internet, and interestingly, in all the photos that I could get hold of that showed the interior of the goods shed, none actually seemed to have any form of hard standing whatsoever, whether it be concrete or cobblestone. So it sort of then further convinced me that it's just really a sort of compacted material. So in terms of this material, of course, there's also plenty of examples out there of really what a goods yard area or any kind of freight yard looks like, and even including engine depot areas as well. And it's not ballast really by any shape. It is really heavily compacted, very fine gravel and dirt, and of course there's other materials mixed in. You've got oil and grease and cinders and ash. So these examples really sort of demonstrate that idea, almost to the point where track disappears in terms of the sleepers, and all that's really visible is the actual rails themselves and partially also the track chairs. So I think with that decision made, it was then a case of actually starting to work out how I'm actually going to do all of this. So looking at where the goods shed is going, it was a case of working out really what is the best method to be able to get in this ground material that's actually going to go around inside the actual goods shed area, but also the ability so I can actually lift the goods shed off to be able to detail this on the inside. And what I sort of thought may be the best method is to place the goods shed in place, and what I'm going to use is some strips of air dry clay or putty, and this is the product here, which is very similar to the DAS air dry clay. This is called Jovi, and you can essentially mold it into any shape, and of course it air dries over a period of time. So my thoughts are to put the good shed in place, and what I've actually done is, in a rather unusual method, wrapped the base where this putty is actually going to go in a bit of cling wrap or cling film, and then I can wedge up this putty against the platform edge and also this wall as well. So the theory is hopefully it's going to work. So based on some of the photos that I showed earlier, there tends to be sort of a bit of a ground build up on the edges anyway, so I'm kind of hoping that this will sort of work out. So I'm just putting a rock on here to stop it from moving about, and the idea, and it's a bit tricky from this angle, is slipping these pieces in here. Now what I actually did prior to placing this is I also sanded the baseboard. Now one of the things I've forgotten to do and I need to do is I'm just going to spread a bit of glue around in the areas that need it. So this is just normal PVA glue that just will help the clay to adhere to the baseboard and hopefully adhere to where I've actually sanded. It's all a bit of an experiment, to be honest, and I'm just hoping that it's going to work. Now the theory is that the cling wrap that is wrapped around the bottom of the building means that I can pull the building out with minimal damage once the air dry clay is gone off. So I'm hoping this is going to work. So it's a bit of a weird way, I guess, of doing this, so I really just don't know how well this is going to work, to be honest. Right, okay, now that has got to be probably the craziest method of doing something I've ever thought of. And when I thought of it initially, I thought, oh, that's a great idea and that's going to work really well. But talk about mission. Now everyone's probably asking, well, this is a lift out section, why don't you just take this lift out section off and then you'll be able to access it a lot better? And absolutely right. If I lifted the section out and did it while it was off the layout, yes, it would have been easier, but I just couldn't be bothered lifting the section off. So anyway, we'll just go with it and see what happens. And of course the next issue will be, hopefully I can lift this good shed off after this putty has actually set. So we'll just see how it goes, and if I haven't pressed down quite enough, of course, with the putty, once it's set, you can sort of chip away at it, you can sand it and do things like that. But anyway, we'll let it dry. It's probably going to take quite a while to dry, so we'll come back to it. Right, so in terms of the ground area that I'm planning on doing around the goods shed and also the sidings is a bit of an unusual blend. So I've been experimenting with some various different materials, and it's quite interesting some of the effects that we sort of get out of these materials. Now, what I'm actually using here is just simple tile grout. So that's a dark grey tile grout, that's a light grey tile grout. This is a blend of the two light and dark grey tile grouts to get a sort of a medium tone, and then some other materials are added in. So for example, this one here has this material here added, and this is Scenic Textures. Now I understand this is actually a New Zealand product, so I don't know where you can buy overseas, but basically to me it looks an awful lot like sand from the beach. So whether or not I paid whatever I did for this for sand, I'm not entirely sure. So that's that material there, and then in this container we have what is a cinder type material, and this is made by Pico, which is this one here. So it's ash and cinders, and it's a fine grade, so that's that material there. So I'm kind of thinking blends of these materials with tile grout is possibly going to create a reasonably effective looking ground area that might be similar to what a railway yard looks like, particularly around a goods yard or even a depot area. So the simple method is to spread this material on. So this one here is a blend of the dark and the light grey tile grout, and then it's had some of this material added, which is kind of a bit like sand in some way. It's got a bit of a more of an earthy tone to it. So we're just going to spread this along the track, and we might as well just use that all up. Now I'm going on the basis I can sort of use a brush to a certain degree to spread this along. Now the idea is that the ground level will really be level with the top of the sleepers, so it's going to be piled up quite a bit. So I'm going to try this, and this is just using a block of wood and pressing this down. So you can, as you can imagine, it will be easier when it comes to actually doing it in the goods yard, because we've got edges that we can run up to. So just using a much smaller brush, I'm just going to get in here and make sure that we don't have this too high up against the edge of the rail. Right, so that's that one. Now I'm going to add in this one here, because the idea is I want to see whether this one here has cinders blended into it. So I wanted to see whether an area where, say for example, locomotives might be paused, that we can actually blend in areas beforehand in order to create these sort of darker areas. That doesn't mean to say that I'm not going to finish off with weathering and staining certain areas that might be prolific with oil and grease. Now, so I'm just rubbing away some of the compound just off some of the sleepers. I just sort of thought maybe it might be interesting to see what happens if not all the sleepers were buried. So that's generally more or less the two compounds that I've been experimenting with, and that is these two here. And I mean, it's not perfect. I'll do a better job, of course, on the real thing, but this is just purely to sort of demonstrate that this is a reasonably good effect. So once you've got it all spread out, then using a very fine mist spray bottle or atomizer, this is mostly water, but it does have a component of IPA in it, and that is basically just sprayed over the entire area, and we really want to get it soaked into the tile grout. Now, I did actually wonder initially whether just using the water would be sufficient and that the tile grout would then actually set, but it didn't really sort of work. It kind of set, but it was quite easy to brush it off and for it to start returning back to its powder state. So once this has been soaked and given a reasonably good soaking, then it's just the usual method of some diluted PVA, or in this case I'm actually using matte Mod Podge, which is diluted about 1/3 Mod Podge, 2/3 water. So just with a simple pipette, it's then just a case of drizzling this along and making sure it's all well and truly soaked into this. So I think this Mod Podge water mix, it does really help to actually bind the tile grout and also the other granules and materials that I've added into here, and seems to create a reasonably solid surface. Now, one of the other methods that I was sort of considering is whether to just simply mix up tile grout as you would do if you were actually tiling, which essentially creates a sort of plastery, pasty type consistency that you'd then spread on with a spatula of some sort. And my thoughts are, I haven't tried it, but my thoughts are that I think it could get quite messy and you just end up with clumps of it maybe dragging along the top of the sleepers, and yeah, I just don't know whether it would actually work as well as if spreading everything out as a dry material and then applying this glue afterwards. So there we have it. That is a very good drenching of glue in there, and it's pretty much how these look before they dried, and these of course are nice and solid now. So we'll just let that go off and set, and that may take quite a while. Right, so it's the next day and this is now more or less dry, and I think it's worked out quite well. I'm overall happy with the outcome from this. It's mostly looking how I sort of intended it to look, and of course once we add some oil spills and grease and a bit of weathering and things like that, I think it's certainly going to look the part. And there is a subtle difference here, so I might add some more cinders into this part in order to create the areas where locomotives might pause for a bit. So it's certainly got the effect of that sort of compacted ground. Of course some of the sleepers are visible, but mostly really it's just disappeared into the ground. So of course, I also had a crack at lifting the goods shed off where I'd added in the air dry clay, and of course what I was expecting is it to be a little bit difficult to lift off, and actually it wasn't too bad at all. So the cling wrap actually worked quite well. What I wasn't expecting was the Tamiya masking tape to actually tear some of the brickwork off the goods shed. So I've kind of patched it up a little bit with some colour pencil, and I think once I do some heavier weathering to that goods shed, which I think I might have suggested in the previous video, I think we can more or less hide those damaged areas. So yeah, a little bit disappointing, but at least the shed actually came off, and once I'd sanded down that clay area, then positioning the goods shed slotted perfectly back into the recesses that were made with that. So that's now going to make it a lot easier, of course, in terms of applying this ground material or compound type material around the areas without having to worry about trying to get inside that engine shed. So I think the next step really actually now is to get on and do the real thing. So I've now finished off preparing the rest of this area for the ground material to be added, and as you can see, what I've done here is just put in some polystyrene fillers which mimic the shape of the rest of the goods shed building. So that's the goods platform area, and this is the office area here, and essentially this is so that I can actually build the ground material up to the edge, and then once it's all set, then I can pull these off. Now these are just double-sided tape down to the baseboard, so hopefully they should be easy enough to take off. I've also masked out this cobblestone area because I'll treat that kind of separately. Probably will have a little bit of dirt and gravel type material that would spill into this cobblestone area. What I've also done is added some blue tack where the switch blades are, so that's packed in around there, and also just over the top of directly over the top of the mechanism, because I really don't want this essentially tile grout, which is very fine powder, getting down into the point motors. So we'll go ahead and start applying this compound and just see how it goes. So I leapt into this with a reasonable amount of confidence, thinking this is a fantastic idea and it's actually going to work really well. Now, I couldn't have been further from the truth. So I went ahead, spread out all the dry compound throughout the yard area, then of course soaked it with a atomizer of water with a little bit of IPA, and then of course drench the whole lot with a glue mixture. Now the glue mixture I use, which I also used in the samples, of course, was some watered down matte Mod Podge. So it was 1 part Mod Podge, 3 parts water, and with the compound already drenched with, of course, the water and the IPA, it did begin to seep into the actual compound material. So I thought, great, this is working really well. Now the issue I struck, which proceeded over the course of the next few days while it was drying, is it didn't appear to be drying, and we had this whitish tinge to everything as if the Mod Podge was still waiting to dry. So I think I got to about day 2 or day 3 and thought, there's something not right here. So I touched it, it was dry, everything seemed fine, and then I sort of picked away at it a little bit with my pair of tweezers, and it just hadn't soaked into the compound, and it had kind of almost made a rubbery latex layer over the top of the compound, and it was essentially basically a complete disaster. So as I picked away at this upper layer, I realized that the glue mixture had not actually seeped all the way through the tile grout compound, and underneath the tile grout was still really essentially in its powder form. So I don't know what the issue was then, because it worked on the sample, but it just didn't work in this scenario, whether or not I didn't actually soak the tile compound with the IPA water mix first enough. Maybe that needed even further soaking in, and I wonder whether maybe the matte Mod Podge was possibly not such a good idea. But then the reason I was using the matte Mod Podge is because white glue or PVA glue tends to leave a little bit of a glossy finish to it. So I don't know, it was quite a disaster. So I ended up scraping up most of it. It did seem to fix into place around the sleepers and the track. It was mainly actually around the big large areas between the track that didn't work. So that all got scraped up, and interestingly I went back and used the method that I didn't think would be such a good idea, and that was to mix the tile grout together beforehand. So essentially what you would actually do if you were laying tiles. So I made that up into a pasty putty type mixture, quite thick so it wasn't overly runny, and then spread that on with some very cheap artist spatulas. And although it was a little bit tricky getting in there, making sure it didn't really sort of get onto other components that I didn't want it to go, I managed to get it down and reasonably sort of flat without it looking too clumpy or bumpy. So I guess in hindsight I would say, in terms of the insights that I've learnt from this, so that you guys out there don't make the same mistake, if you plan on doing a yard area and you want to go down the tile grout route, I think maybe it might be best if you made up the grout beforehand into the pasty putty type mixture and then spread it around using some spatulas, rather than the silly method that I used of thinking that the dry powder would actually set. So that's where we're at this stage, and I think I've made a reasonably okay salvage rescue situation on the Goodsyard and the groundwork. So I think there's enough of a basis there for me to be able to actually begin weathering and adding weeds and debris, grease, oil stains and all of that type of material, just to really bring it to life. So obviously in the next video we'll be looking at those components, and I'll also be weathering up the Goodsyard, because I really do believe that it needs to tie in a little bit better with the retaining wall weathering, and I need to weather it anyway and get it sealed in with a matte varnish, because it needs protecting. I don't think I actually did that when I weathered it some years back. So I'll leave it there for today's video. I certainly hope you've all gained some inspiration and ideas for your own layouts, or maybe some things not to do on your layout, particularly when it comes to doing any kind of groundwork for a siding or goods yard or even a TMD area. So do take care everyone, look after yourselves, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.